Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update for the 8th of March 2024. Thank you for choosing to check my channel out for your news of the Ukraine war. Let's go to where we normally start. The Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, or the usual caveat supply, of course. We have numbers that are in many categories less than they were yesterday, and in other categories more. 880 personnel lost is at the higher end of the spectrum, given our frame of reference being a couple of years ago. 880 would be huge. Now we are used to 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 even personnel being lost. Remember, these are human beings. 880 is a decent number as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, but still, 400 off where we have been seeing it the last couple of weeks. So there is that. 11 tanks is a useful number of tanks for the Ukrainians to attrit. 19 armoured personnel vehicles and 25 artillery systems. They're all down on yesterday's numbers, and I think the day before as well, but still fairly hefty numbers for the Russians to deal with when they are consistently like this. 2 multiple launch rocket systems and 3 anti-aircraft warfare systems. That is a good haul for the Ukrainians in those categories. As you can see, that is above the daily average for anti-aircraft warfare systems. That'd be useful there. 66 vehicles and fuel tanks is a very significant number. They're hurting the Russian logistic capabilities, and 9 pieces of special equipment, likewise, a decent haul. So we go to Andrew Perpetua's loss statistics, looking at, these are his most recent figures. As you can see, the stats are in favour of the Ukrainians again. The Ukrainians have certainly got that ratio in their favour over the last few days at least. We're looking there at about another 5-to-1 ratio of Russian losses to Ukrainian losses, exactly what the Ukrainians will want. And if we look at the Ukrainian pieces of equipment here listed to see what the value difference between the two are, we have AS-90, so that's a UK given self-propelled gun from the 1990s. It is a pretty decent bit of kit. The Ukrainians apparently like it a lot, but yeah, that has been damaged by an airstrike. Damage is unclear, but a building fell on it, according to Andrew Perpetua. A couple of PT-91. These are the upgraded T-72 tanks that the Czechs have the Polish upgraded, sorry, and turned into the PT-91 Twardie. A couple of those appear to have been destroyed, according to some FPV drone footage. A few T-64 BVs damaged. We have civilian stuff then for the rest of the pieces, including, it looks like, a goat. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. So Andrew sometimes puts in odd things like that. So you can probably take that out, and the ratio would be even more beneficial to the Ukrainians. Now let's see if the Russians have lost high-value equipment. 3 bits of surveillance and comms equipment. We have a Grad and a TOS-1. So you've got multiple launch rocket systems, thermobaric system, damaged or destroyed there, so that's fairly high value. Then we have a number of tanks, T-80s, T-72s, and some unknown tanks there. Quite a few thrown in, some BMP-2s, 3s, and a couple of BMP-1s as well, some APCs, and then a whole host of Russian trucks and civilian type vehicles. So I think the Russians again have lost a greater mass of stuff that's just not sustainable for them going forward. Or the question is, how long can they sustain those kinds of losses? The Ukrainians will not like losing those PT-91 Twardies and that AS-90, but that when you look at what the Russians are losing in comparison, they'd take that, I guess, every day of the week. Okay, when we look at every day I give you the Ukrainian General Staff figures, and I do so because I think they are somewhat accurate, possibly pretty accurate, especially given the claims to do with categories we can much more easily verify. So that's the mechanized equipment and whatnot. With personnel, there's a lot more guesstimation going in there. There are these criteria that they have to jump through when they're providing these figures to their bosses and then to the general staff. So there needs to be visual verification. There is a protocol and a process that takes place when these figures are released. They aren't just pulled out of posteriors. And which I think is interesting, and I spend a lot of time looking at data to support these general staff figures, and then I get certain pro-Russian types saying, why don't you give us Russian figures for the Ukrainian losses? And that's because there are no decent figures. Either they're not produced, or occasionally the Russian MOD bring out some figures, but they're so laughably out of the window. They're so fanciful and pure fantasy that don't cry wolf. If you're going to overtly lie, then I don't need to give you credence, and I don't need to amplify your message. Let's just drop into what they have said. This is from the Russian embassy in South Africa that often produces a lot of overt propaganda. Official data by the Russian Ministry of Defense, special military operation. They can't even call it a war yet. I mean, grow up, guys. Just freaking grow up. Since the beginning of the operation, it's pathetic. Since the beginning of the operation, the Russian armed forces have eliminated 15,377 tanks and other armoured vehicles, 14,440 unmanned aerial vehicles, 8,309 field artillery and mortar guns. And then this is the one I always talk about, 576 aircrafts. Now, they seem to be calling that aircrafts now. So whether that's fixed-wing aircraft or whether that includes helicopters, I have a feeling it's fixed-wing aircraft, because it used to be that their fixed-wing aircraft was something like 450. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be fixed-wing and not helicopters. And then helicopters are separate, and I'm sure both those together was more than that. But anyway, when it was sort of 400 and whatever, I had to keep pointing out that the Ukrainians started the war with something like 236 fixed-wing aircraft. So if the Russians have destroyed well over double their entire air fleet, then it's just fanciful nonsense. The Ukrainians have struggled to get hold of extra airframes. They've got a number of sort of MiG-29s, and a few Sukhois probably from here and there, but they were given from Slovakia and Czechia, I think it was. Or was it Poland? Slovakia and Poland, actually, I think. Those MiG-29s, about 30 MiG-29s. But really, then there aren't too many airframes outside of those. A few others that were disassembled and then assembled back in Ukraine. But we're not talking about 250 plus airframes. And then, of course, if these Russian figures are true, that they would have literally no planes at all. That would be their entire air force done. And of course, it's not done because they're still operational and doing stuff. So just, it's great that this claim has been community noted. But this is why I don't communicate the Russian stats for the Ukrainian losses, because they're just BS. Right. Russia is visually confirmed to have lost, and this has come from Richard Vereka of War Spotting, lost almost 100 of its best tanks, the T90 so far. This is what I keep talking about, so it's great that he's done this analysis, because I keep saying I'm pretty sure they've lost their entire fleet of T90Ms, at least the fleet that they started the war with. So this indicates that they probably are constructing them. They only started with about 100 of those. Anyway, of T90s in total, they've lost about 100, almost 100 of its best tanks. But there's been a dramatic shift in the type. At the start, they were almost all the T90A, the older model, then increasingly numbers of T90M. So that's a breakthrough tank, the T90M. So if we look at that, it's the orange numbers here, and that's what I keep saying recently. They are losing loads of them at the moment. So these are the losses on each quarter. It doesn't give you an indication of the relative number of those losses. So it could be that, there was 2,000 here and only 6 here, right? So it That's not the case, obviously, but I'm, to make the point that these are percentages rather than the whole numbers. It'd be lovely if there was a well, I don't know if you could map that at all on the same graph. Anyway, dramatic shift to the T90M with a brief showing of the T90S. Now, the T90S is the export model, and there was talk about how Russia. I can't verify this, but an Indian journalist did write an article that I shared with you saying that India sent a bunch of T90Ss back, the export variant, back to Russia to be updated or to have something changed on them. And the claim was that Russia then started using those, like essentially stealing a bunch of tanks off the Indians that were due to be sent back and pulled those to the front line. Don't know how true that is, but they certainly have lost some T90Ss, which are vehicles they shouldn't be using. That's the export variety. In my opinion, this was because they wanted to preserve the old T90As to be upgraded before going back into battle. By the end of 2023, it was the T90As only, but this year we have seen a return of both T90A and S models. This might be random, as a lot actually means to say T90M with one of those he meant to say. Anyway, this might be random, as a lot of the Russian army is, or a sign that they are short on tanks on the front line. Data table below. So let's just actually pop into that data to see. I don't know if there's a total sum of. Is there? No, it'd be lovely. Let's have a look at the T90M here. So total 51. Okay, right. So that I was saying the other day that I'm sure that I'd said previously that some of the stats I'd seen was about 45% of their T90Ms have been lost. Well, actually, this is only saying 51, which would be, since they started the war with about 100, that is only 50-odd% of T90Ms. So I go back on that. But there's some discrepancy. Many of them might have been damaged and then repaired and brought back. Which could understand that, because there's been a lot of T90Ms lost recently, and that would be well above the T90 previous T90M number that I had of like 44, I think. And they've lost loads recently, and for it to only be 51, there's something funky going on there. So I would need to look into that. But anyway, interesting stats. And Richard Vareka does another post here. Russia's lost at least. And we're talking about T72s and T80s now. 733 T80s visually confirmed. The T80 has become their most important tank. The T90 might be slightly better, but there are many more T80s. There are probably more T80s on the front line now than T72s. They have also shown a dramatic change over the war. The force was mostly T80Us. They have all but disappeared. Instead, it's now mostly T80 BVs. There is an ongoing program to upgrade BVs to BVMs. This is probably ongoing, but still only a small proportion of our BVMs. There are also all T2022, OBR 2022, modified BV and BVMs that have more ERA, so explosive reactive armor, but not that many of these either. There have also been 3 of the T80B models lost, so it had been thought that all of these old B variants have been upgraded to BVs years ago, but some must have missed that upgrade cycle. Okay, now these are different types. The 2022 variety, if I'm correct in saying, is actually, the specifications aren't actually that good because they were unable to put good equipment into it. But nonetheless, there's your data set for the types of T80s that are being destroyed at the moment. And there are still many bits of video coming out of the front line of things getting blown up, as you would expect. But the Russians certainly still taking significant losses in their attacks. The question is, do their attacks still gain them momentum and gain them territorial control? The 79th Airborne Assault Brigade here repelling a huge Russian assault in the Novomikhailivka direction, and the Russians losing an awful lot of stuff again. I am wondering whether the Ukrainians do have more artillery at the moment. It does seem like I'm seeing more footage of artillery taking out vehicles rather than just a first-person view drones. We went through a time period of there being far fewer artillery strikes being recorded and far more FPV drones being used. Okay. But that's just my speculation. Yeah, take it for what it is. Right, moving on to distant strikes. We have a large wave of drones again last night. Russia attacked Ukraine with a total of 37 drones, of which 33 were shot down. The interception rates are very good at the moment. Very good indeed for the Ukrainians. Now, a lot of these are being sent, as it says here, they were launched mostly from the southern direction, aimed for the southern and eastern regions. A lot of these seem to be going for Odessa and grain and port infrastructure and storage around those southern, southwestern directions there. So, yeah, I can't confirm that's what happened last night. There were explosions in around Odessa, so I'm fairly sure that's at least part of it. And then it talks about eastern regions, so that could be using them closer to the front line, which we have seen occasionally. But anyway, yeah, the 33 out of 37 is a good interception rate, and the Ukrainians seem to be in a better position at the moment for taking those drones down. As mentioned here, this is Max 23 saying there were explosions in Odessa. The city is again under attack from Russian drones. Now, yesterday there was some quite amazing footage. In fact, this is the footage. It is pretty substantial. So this is from inside a factory, the Cherepovets. A drone attack caused an explosion at the Severstal metallurgical plant, which is, I believe, the biggest one. Earlier metallurgical plants in the Lipetsk and Kursk regions have been attacked. Drones attacked already the third major steel plant in Russia. As I said, I think it might be the biggest. An explosion occurred at one of Russia's largest steel mills due to a drone attack, according to Russian media. The general director of Cherepovets steel plant claimed a technological incident in the blast furnace production, but local media claimed the real cause of the explosion was a drone attack. Subsequently, the acting governor of the Vologda region confirmed that an unmanned aerial vehicle of unidentified origin had hit the plant. I just think we're going to see lots more of these kinds of incidents as the Ukrainians build up their capacities in those sorts of drones. Russia claims it stopped 16 drones launched by Ukraine overnight, and this is the kind of thing we're seeing. The other night it was 38 drones in Crimea alone. Last night, 16 drones. Just these numbers are much greater than we've seen over previously. So 3 months ago, there would occasionally be a drone here and a drone there. Maybe get into St. Petersburg, maybe get into Moscow if you're lucky. And now we're seeing 38, 16. And honestly, I think we're moving into a different phase of the war where the industrial capacity for Ukraine in terms of these larger drones that can fly into Russia, that they don't need to rely on outside nations or entities to provide the drones, but then say, oh, you can't use them into Russia. They are making their own drones and missiles that they can fly into Russia. And we're starting to see significant numbers being used on a nightly basis. Kremlin reckons it down 15 drones over Volgograd region and another in Belgorod. Sorry. So there you go. They are doing that quite consistently, and also, of course, hitting inside the occupied territories as well. Anyway, here is, no, it's not just loud in Mariupol and the surrounding area, but Nashi Ochivzyu reports something similar to a falling air target in the direction Taganrog. So that's just over the border from in the Mariupol direction. You've got Berdyansk on the Azov Sea, just northeast of Crimea, Berdyansk, Mariupol, and then you've got just over the Russian border, you've got Taganrog and then Rostov-on-Don. So that's where there are loud explosions around Mariupol, around Taganrog. So again, into Russia, but also in occupied territories. And then this morning, explosions reported in occupied Skadovsk in the Kherson region. So you've got Crimea just here. And you've got, and not for the first time, Skadovsk is routinely targeted. There are significant bases and, pieces of equipment or whatever down in Skadovsk that get hit on a regular basis. Right, that's moving on from distance strikes to other bits and pieces here. So This is a very major strategic warning for all of Europe, and it confirms my very worst fears, which I shared in an interview with Euromaidan Press. The Russian state policy here combines a Stalinist attitude with a basically Nazi attitude, as Ukrainians are viewed as lapsed Russians. Any Ukrainian fighting men who are captured, and probably any Ukrainian men of fighting age, will be press-ganged into the Russian Imperial Army or will be put into forced labour. That means that if we do not secure a Ukrainian victory over the Russian invaders, we will face an even more monstrously enlarged enemy in the near future. Of course, this policy of the Russian state is as criminal and as morally despicable as it can get, and we should aim to arrest or physically neutralise all those who promote that policy. But that is, as yet, a distant dream. The immediate priority is to arm Ukraine considerably more and considerably better. Any European leader who gets in the way of that top priority must be removed by hook or by crook. Ukraine must be made to win. And if Ukraine cannot be made to win alone, we must also very seriously envisage a direct intervention in the current war to ensure defeat of the Russian aggressor state. The entire logic of avoiding escalation must be swept off the table. We are now facing a new Nazism here, and the longer we wait, the more dangerous it will become. A related issue is the pace of change that is needed in our side in order to get clearly ahead of the evolving threat. We must switch to counting in months rather than in years. That is a key lesson from history. Our forefathers paid a heavy price in 1940 for being insufficiently prepared, and though they worked hard in the 12 to 24 months prior to rise to the challenge. But when the test came at the moment of the aggressor's choosing, it was all over for France in the space of 6 weeks, and Britain came very dangerously close to disaster. All the warning signs, I mean, we were lucky that we were an island, but it's pretty much, what allowed us to maintain our safety. All the warning signs are there. Only extremely bold leadership, with or without the United States, can prepare us for what is to come and to put us on the more courageous trajectory that we need. So this is really big statements. First of all, talking about how the Russians will take on Ukrainian soldiers or civilians, Ukrainians, and then mobilize them, force them into the army, which we have seen in Donbass, we have seen in occupied territories, and of course they end up fighting their own people. Really, is pretty horrific. But then, it's this idea that, man, we need to be stepping up now, not worrying about escalation in Europe and in the West. On the Zaporizhzhia front, footage showing the construction of the Zaluzhny line and fortifications, not one step back. Interesting that they're called the Zaluzhny line, like the Surovikin line for the Russians. So this is actually really good news. Now, we already knew that the Zaporizhzhia area was looking good for fortifications. So interestingly, the complaints about Ukrainians' fortifications seem to come from the east. And I don't know if this is a hallmark of when there were regional areas in charge of getting fortifications built, and it was kind of devolved down to particular commanders in areas rather than being an all-over national strategy. And I think it eventually became that reporting on that sort of, I can't remember when, maybe 6 months ago, when they said, right, we've got a central planning hub now for fortifications, and these are the people in charge of it, blah blah blah. Of course, you're thinking, well, that's great, but 1.5 years into the war, that's kind of a bizarre time to start doing that. I should have been like right at the beginning. And these are the ongoing criticisms of the Ukrainian armed forces, or the political criticisms concerning the construction of the fortifications and whose responsibility it was. The army complaining they didn't have X, Y, and Z. The politicians going, well, it's the army's responsibility. But then the army says, well, yeah, but you've got to give us the means to do that, etc., etc., and kind of went on and on. But now it seems to be being sorted out adequately. Certainly around Zaporizhzhia looks good for the Ukrainians. The east is the problem, as I mentioned. Right. I did that breaking news piece, very short one last night for me, on Zaluzhny moving from being the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces to being removed and then becoming the ambassador. And just wondering what his role would be, why the UK. Okay, UK probably because of the language barrier not being so significant. If you had to become the ambassador to France or Germany, you've got to learn those languages if you don't know them. But he's probably got a fairly adequate grasp of English, so that's your advantage there. So I guess the UK makes the most sense just for things like that. We forget about the prevalence of the English language. I talked about this before, about how people, the UK has just a natural advantage, as does America, in terms of rallying people, doing international diplomacy, or getting a message out to the international world, because English is the international language. You don't need subtitles. You don't need someone dubbing over it. It's just so it's easier to share messages from English, and that gives British people. That's why. So who was saying to me before? I think it was a Ukrainian one of the people that gave me a lift back or to Poland in Ukraine, saying, we listen to the opinions of the British politicians much more than we do other politicians. I was trying to work out exactly why that is. I think it probably is a language thing as much as it is a legacy of our imperial past, where we have an outsized power considering the size of our nation. So there are all these elements, but point is, okay, so he's in UK, and that's probably a lot to do with language. What can he do in terms of moving things on in the UK? I mean, what will be his agenda? So on and so forth. And will he be trying to join the UK to Europe more, given we're outside the EU now, etc., etc.? Okay. I don't mean in political sense. I mean in like working together for Ukraine. But then other people have been saying it's interesting that he's been sent out the country. So this is a way of Zelensky kind of getting rid of Zelensky, who could be a political threat, considering he's incredibly popular domestically. A way of getting rid of that threat and him still being of some use, but essentially out of the country. In the long and distinguished tradition of nervous civilians exiling ambitious generals to faraway ambassadorships, says Shashank Joshi. There you go. So it could be something to do with that. As Michael Kaufman says, it's a good deal for both of them considering the alternatives. This is a mutually beneficial outcome for both him and Zelensky. Interesting. Let me know what you think. Right, moving on. I didn't put this in the geopolitical stuff. I often put Starlink and SpaceX and stuff like that in this other section. US Democrats have launched an investigation into SpaceX over the Russians' use of Starlink in Ukraine, according to the Washington Post. This is massive, and it doesn't surprise me. And do you know what? Good, because I've been pretty fed up. But as people keep saying, you can easily turn off individual terminals. And, there is this oversight that SpaceX can have with the use of Starlink. And yet we know that Russians are using thousands of Starlink near the front line and in Luhansk and in Crimea, which is, as far as I can work out, a direct violation of sanctions. Literally, this is not only a sanction violation, it is an intelligence threat. And it is contrary to the diplomatic efforts of the US government. I don't understand how this is still able to happen. And it appears, and you can come up with some whatever excuse to exonerate Musk and Starlink, but I don't buy it. The guy's a tool, and everything he's saying at the moment, if you go and look at everything Elon Musk is saying on Twitter and elsewhere, everything he's saying is aligned to a MAGA Trumpism. And remember, Trump went and visited him the other day. And although he said, I'm not giving any money to either party, he's amplifying he's not amplifying the Republican viewpoint, he's amplifying the MAGA Republican viewpoint, which is effectively pro-Putin. Go and look at everything the man is saying. You can have a go at me for having a go at Musk, but man, I'm looking at what he's saying. So the Democrats are then, or the US government is then investigating Musk's SpaceX because of this nonsensical approach to, well, it does make sense actually, because of course he's beholden to Russia and he's beholden to China in terms of the raw materials that he has to get from Russia and China, and they allow him still to get that stuff. So what's a quid pro quo? How can Russia still be allowing SpaceX and Starlink and Elon Musk to be doing business in Russia, to be getting raw materials from Russia? Surely they'll be cutting that off. Surely this is a US company that's so phenomenally important in intelligence gathering, in satellites, in whatever, and yet he's still able to work with impunity in Russia and China. What are they getting out of it? Follow the money. or in this case, follow the natural resources, the raw materials, and the money exchange for it. What are they getting out of him being able to do what he does, economically speaking? And you might be the biggest lover of Elon Musk, but I'm sorry, you need to answer that question. So Democrats have sent a letter to SpaceX asking the company to clarify whether it also prevented illegal purchases of Starlink terminals, which could violate US sanctions and export control rules. Now, when I talk about sanctions, I talk about it's really difficult to stop sanctions. So many of you come back and say, actually, what you need to do is put the onus on the original seller to make sure that there is this duty of care, or that they have a good handle on where the end point is going to be, and they can put restrictions on who buys from them. And force the people who buy from them to put restrictions, so on. So there are ways of being able to deal with this, and if they have good reason to know that, and they know the ones that are being used, each terminal, it's just, you can turn it off. But anyway, it's good that they are being investigated. Right. Now, Chris Jones, who's he's designed loads of stuff that's on like Redbubble t-shirts and things that I'm messing around with. You can check them out in the description below. That's a bit of a spam alert for you, but there is merchandise for the channel and whatnot. Anyway, he reached out to me yesterday and said, this is really frustrating. And rightly so. So he has had a review for Active Measures, which I think everyone should go and watch. Active Measures. It's an Amazon funded, or it's part of their TV output. It's a documentary that it looks at the Russian interference in US politics from sort of 2016 onwards, and before actually, and it's an insanely good documentary. As you can see, Chris Jones here gives it a 5-star review. It is so dense with information and is exceptionally scary. Okay, so he writes a review which the title is "Excellent Documentary Exposing Putin as a Coward." That review has been banned by Amazon because of the phrase "Putin as a coward." Like, this is the reach now, I think, of Putin. Like, for that to be called hate speech, I mean, that is not a freedom of speech, right? This is a censorship that I bet if you did a review that said "Excellent Documentary Exposing Sunak as a Coward" or "Biden as a Coward," you would not get pulled. So what is it that is doing this? Chris rightfully reaches out to me to complain about this, and so it can be amplified a little bit. I want to know why that triggers, the review. There's nothing wrong with the review. It's just a normal review, well produced, informative, and since Navalny's death, poignant documentary exposing Russian political paranoia and political control. There you go. Excellent documentary exposing Putin as a coward. Just, it's really frustrating that they are getting the upper hand in the information, and it may be just a case of gaming the system. It may just be an innocent triggering of something here, but I don't get why you would have an algorithm that would flag this. I don't understand how that can happen. And so this kind of stuff, it really gets to me, because Russian information space control, or the control of our information space by Russia, is insanely scary. Anders Puck Nielsen has released a really good video that you need to watch. Yesterday, I think it came out, about what we need to do to fight back, and actually how we need to have our own troll farms kind of thing, but not doing what the Russians do. Our propaganda, if we did like pure propaganda that was conspiracy theories and lies, it wouldn't work on the Russian population, because of the way their whole information spaces are kind of organized, and what we need to be, and it's something I've said before, we need to be providing positive narratives and pointing out things in Russian to Russians about corruption inside Russia, which is not lies, which is just, there's the truth. So like we shouldn't be doing to Russia what they did to us, but we need to be fighting back in the information spaces in a way that that is robust and gives us a fighting chance. Anyway, go and watch that and let me know what you think. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.